Welcome to the channel. If you're new here, I'm Dan Lee and I'm currently building a quarter scale model of a new boat design called Temptress, so that at quarter scale I can show you guys the exact way that we will build a full-size boat. And in the last video we looked at doing the chine lamination, so we're currently working towards getting all the components of this boat ready to do a big installation. Chines were in last week. This week we're going to be looking at the stem, so getting that sat correctly where it needs to be, and we're also going to be laminating the keel as well. Then we'll have all the components that we need to start to do a complete glue up on the boat. So let's get going with that. Okay, so in order to do that job, we're going to start to be doing some hand plane work on the boat. There's going to be quite a bit of that coming up, and I've got a selection of tools that I could possibly use for doing that. This plane here is my kind of go-to bench plane for doing boat building work. It's a really nice size, and it's basically just a bigger version of a block plane. This plane here is basically exactly the same thing, but just a little bit smaller. How cool are these little planes? Check it out. So this is the small bench plane in comparison to the full-size one. Quite a difference, but these might be toy size, but they are by no means toy standards. They're built to the exact same standards that all the Veritas stuff is, so we've got a really nice quality set of planes here, and they are perfectly functional. They've still got all the same adjustments as you would have on the full-size plane, yet they're going to be perfectly sized for working on our model. In all seriousness, these kind of tools are far too big for working on a quarter scale model, and it's going to make it really tricky to be able to do all of the shaping and beveling work that we're going to have to do on the boat. These are going to be perfect for it. So we've got a little tiny bevel up bench plane, we've got a little block plane, we've got a little spoke shave, and we've got a little shoulder plane. And the shoulder plane is what we're going to use for shaping the notches on the first couple of frames to take our stem. Now I've got to thank Mark from Nomad Boatbuilding, because he put me onto these little tiny tools. I saw him using them the other week on Instagram on his quarter scale builds that he's doing ahead of some stuff that he's working on. So make sure you check him out on Instagram and on YouTube as well. He's a really great boat builder, so thanks for the tip off, Mark. So we're going to use the little shoulder plane. Let's put that to work on the first couple of frames and get our stem in. So we're going to get our stem dropped down into place then. You can see if we take a look at the underside here, where that goes through these notches, we've got some substantial gaps in the aft end. We're touching in the forward end. So what we need to do is to bevel these to match the curvature of the stem, and we'll progressively get this dropped down to its correct height so that it sits nicely on all of these cutouts. So as I've mentioned before, what we do with these cutouts is that they're extruded to be square, because these have got to be cut on a CNC machine. So these have to start life square, and the way that we size those within the plans is that we reference the face that doesn't need to be beveled, and we pull that straight through as a square extrusion. So what happens is that you're able to then size that bevel using that back face as your reference. And that's only a rough reference, because that is subject to a number of different factors, such as this frame being perfectly in the right place and height. So there's no real substitute for the human eye looking over things. So if you remember when we did frame 9, we kind of followed that process where we took a line and struck it through the highest corners of each of the parts here. That gave us our correct bevel for the chine to sit on there. So we're going to do the same process here, and so you can see that this gusset is an indication of where we need to be on the forward end. These are aligned on the inside faces, using this keel filler here to get that gusset correctly positioned. So you can see we've got a slight indifference here, and you'll see that in a lot of the parts. So you can also see that on the gussets here. So that is an indication of the angle that our bevel is going to be in this direction when we bevel the notch there to take the chine. You can see it's an indication of what needs to be done here on the stem landing. And then you can also see that that slightly reduces as we get through frames 2 and frame 3 to where it's pretty much nothing in the aft frames. So let's get our little duty plane on the go and take some material off. So the shoulder plane, if you haven't seen one before, is a plane like this which has got perfectly square shoulders on it. So if you look at the cross section of the plane, you've got vertical sides, you've got a nice obviously flat sole as you do with any plane, and then you've got a blade which runs right to the edges of the plane, so it allows you to work right up into a square corner, cutting rebates, notches, things like that. This is my full size Clifton one, which is a 3-in-1, so I can actually change the nose of this plane to various different sizes, or I can take the nose off altogether, and then that will allow me to finish right up into a corner, a bit like a chisel plane. So that's quite handy every now and then. So what we've got here is the little tiny one. So as you can see, the blade runs up to the right edges of the plate, and that just allows me to work right up into a square corner in a little tiny notch like we're doing, and remove the material. It also gives a lot more reference because you can sort of see the angle that you're coming through at, so you can sight that against what you're doing as you go through the frame, and gives you really good control. A little bit more than you do with the chisel, because although with the chisel you can sight down it, you've not got something sticking forward ahead of where you're cutting, and not quite so much reference for what's going on. So let's get going. Okay, so we've got that notches beveled now in those forward 3 frames, so the stem only runs up as far as frame 3 and then it terminates on this bulkhead. So you can see that we've got those progressively beveled, and what I've actually done is I took this stem mould out just to give a little bit of better access to this frame, and then what I've done is, and now that I've got that beveled, I've matched that back into there, and then I've actually glued it to frame 1. Because frame 1 isn't supported by the stringers, see all of these frames are really quite rigid where we've got the stringers in place. Frame 1 is kind of flopping around a little bit, and that was making it a little bit difficult to work on. But now that I'm happy that the stem mould is at the correct height and it matches in with that bevel notch, I've just glued that onto there. So on the full size boat you could put a little clamp in there or something and just screw that to the frame, or screw right through it. I'd probably recommend fixing that to it in some way or other to make sure that things are just right, and checking as well that the frame is remaining vertical. So what you don't want to be doing is pushing that frame over in this direction or pulling it back. So plenty of checks to what's going on with the frames is a really good idea. You can either do that by running a spirit level up the legs. You could drop a plumb bob from the top down, and as you can see here, if I had that plumb bob off the face of the bulkhead there, that's actually going to match that little packer that I've got on the deck beam there. So if you ran a string line with a plumb bob on it from the top of there down, you should see it just touch that. Playing around with plumb bobs on my quarter scale model is going to get a little bit fiddly, so we won't be doing that, but a number of ways you can do that on the proper boat. So we'll get the stem lamination. You can see what I've done here is just use my little baby spoke shave, taking the inside edges off of this just around, got a slight radius in those, so just match that with the with the stem so that can fit in there, and then we've got it pushed down into place. So it's good to have these lines on the stem that we marked in the previous video and use them just as a double check reference to make sure that we're fitting up against the solid wood portion on the frame, so that we know that this is in the right position. And then you can see, if we look under those now, we've got that beveled so that it sits nicely. We are still central on our mould here, so we want all of this to remain. What we don't want is that this stem to be twisting off to one side or anything, so we can use our stem mould as a guidance for that, and then get it all in place. So now that our stem is correctly positioned, we can start to look at what's going to happen with the keel. So if we take a look at the drawings, then you can see that what we've got currently on the boat is this, so it's the full thickness lamination all the way through the stem. Now what we actually need to get to is this here, and you can see that there's this flat cut on the aft end of the stem, and that is to take the keel. You can see the keel there that runs through the boat, and then we've got the transition here where the two of them join. So what we're going to need to do is to cut that flat onto the stem so that we can get the whole full length of the keel laminated into place. Okay, so I'm going to level with you. This is getting into the realms of stuff that I haven't done for a long time now. The last time I actually did a new stem on a boat was when I built Missile. And when I actually did the stem on Missile, that was a long time ago. Some of you guys might have seen one of my really old videos where I did the stem on Missile. And yeah, it was a little while ago. So I'm a little bit rusty on this, and I've certainly never done a stem that is quite so advanced as this one. So there may be a bit of working things out to do. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to roughly shape this to begin with. I'm going to get, because there's quite a lot of material I've got to remove here, I'm going to get the bulk of that taken off, I think. So let's get this lamination marked up. You can see in these in frames 2 and 3 the where the cutout widens slightly. That's where our keel height wants to land, so we know at least where that's going to be from there, and we haven't got that reference on frame 1. Basically what we want to do is to follow on a nice fair keel line from there, so we should be able to get pretty close. I think we'll get it all worked out in the end. I've actually got a little tiny batten that's going to fit into that cutout that runs up the side of those there, so what I'm going to do is just pin that in place and run that down to the bottom of all these cutouts to get me a nice fair keel line, and then that should give me approximately the line that I want to be finishing to. So you can see where that runs out just over the top of frame 1 there. So let's mark that on. Okay, so that's what we're looking at, and you can see which bit has got to be scrapped. There's actually a fair amount on that aft section of that stem. So let's pop down to the shop. We'll rough cut the stock out of that on the bandsaw. Okay, so same practice that I'm always preaching about. We want to make sure that we cut outside of the line and that we leave that line there for our master reference. So I'm going to be cutting on the scrap side of that line and make sure that I leave a bit of it left so that we can see what's going on. I've got my blade guard up a little bit higher, and that is only so that you can see what's going on with the blade, and you can see where I'm cutting. Normally I'd have it right down pretty close to the piece of stock I'm working on. Okay, so we'll cut down to height, and you can see that we've still got that pencil line there We want to keep that visible so that we've got a reference as to how much material we're taking off, and we'll slowly come down to that on the boat as we get things dialed into the right place. Let's see how it fits. Okay, so what we should have is a nice line that sights all the way down that keel, and we're going to just drop a little batten in place to see just how well that is working. Okay, so there was something mentioned in the comments last week, and this is again from Mark from Nomad Boatbuilding, so thanks for that, Mark. He pulled me up on the fact that what I should have done really was lay a batten across the landings of these chines and make sure that everything was nice and fair and that there weren't any high spots and low spots within these chine landings. If there were highs and lows within this, what we would do is we would transmit them through into the lamination. So if the landings of the chine weren't fair, what you'd end up doing is transmitting that through into the lamination, and then you'd have to fair that out and take thickness out of the lamination, which you don't want to be doing. You want to make sure that these are nice and fair and the correct height from the start. Now, probably the reason that I overlooked that is that one of the things we're doing with this boat is obviously we've CNC cut all the parts. We're setting all of the frames up using a laser level system. And what that does is that puts us in a position where all of this framework and this setup process is actually really accurate by comparison to a boat that's lofted. That makes this whole process from this stage a little bit better out the gate. And there's going to be a little bit less of that fairing and kind of getting things right because we're going to be quite so accurate from the start. So that is one of the benefits from CNC. But that being said, there is no substitute for looking down the lines of a boat by eye and double checking that all of these things are just right, because you've only got to be 2 mil on the full size boat, 2 to 5 mil low on one of these frames, and you're going to start to induce a low spot and you'll just be chasing it out throughout the rest of the build. So it definitely still needs to be checked, in spite of the fact we're working with quite an accurate setup system here. And the way that we'll do that is just with a nice long fair batten. So what you want, and what you will want throughout several stages of this build, is a nice straight grained piece of batten timber. And the thickness of this may vary depending on what sort of stuff we're looking to fair in, if there's any twist in it, as there's going to be in the top side battens. But something that you can lay throughout all the landings in a section of the boat, such as the keel like this. And what we're going to do is we're going to use that to find any high and low spots. We're going to get a nice fair curve to that keel and make any adjustments necessary, either with the cutouts or possibly even an adjustment in the height of the frame. Now, we've set those up on a laser level, so we know that the frames are pretty damn close. But on the scale that I'm working on, a couple of millimeters can make a bit of difference. Basically, what we're going to do is we're going to look for high and low spots on all of these landings throughout the keel before we install it. And we're going to make the decision as to whether we make an adjustment on the frame or whether we just take that adjustment out in the beveling of the notch. So let's run this batten down through the frames and see what we've got going on. So you want a nice fair batten to begin with. You certainly don't want any knots in this piece of timber, because that's going to create a hard spot. It's not going to give you a nice fair even curve. You want a really nice, to be honest, it doesn't even have to be timber. It could be something like a sail batten. Those are really good for this, like a carbon fiber or a fiberglass bit of flat, or possibly even like I've got a couple of pieces of like flat metal that I use for straight edges and things like that. Anything that's sort of rigid enough to form a nice even curve. And then we're going to lay that all the way throughout the boat here and see what we have going on. Okay, so with our batten run through the keel line, we are pretty fair. We're not too far out, to be honest. You can see that we've got a nice even landing on a lot of these frames. What we really don't want to be seeing is something like this on one of the frames. If you've got that on just one frame, then you know that you're going to be significantly low in that area, and then you want to start to investigate where that might have come from. So double check your laser line against your waterline 1 marks, make sure that your frame is at the correct height, and also sort of check that against the chines. So if you've got one frame that is low on the chine line and on the keel line, you know for definite that that frame is too low in the setup, and that's going to start to cause you problems. So on the full-size boat, you'll be able to make adjustments to these legs, and at that stage, to be honest, I would let that rule your decision rather than the waterline 1 mark. Could be the case that there's a slight error in marking that. What you really want to be doing is to get a good fair curvature of the keel and the chines right throughout the boat at this stage. So I would let that be your governing marker. So we've got the same thing on frame 9 again as we had with the chines. We've got the angled frame which is causing our stepped section there. So we're going to get the little miniature shoulder plane out and we're just going to bevel through that and then see how our keel batten looks afterwards. Okay, so this is the kind of sight line I'm trying to do with my eye. I'm trying to just replicate that with the camera. And what you're aiming to do is just look up and down that keel and just follow the edge of that batten and see if it's sitting nicely, if you've got any gaps underneath frames, if you've got any humps sticking up in that batten. And what we want is a nice fair curve throughout its length. You can see I've just got that tacked down on frame 7 because it was just wanting to sit up a little bit there. And you can also run your finger along this batten, and if you're pushing it down any significant amount as you go passing through each frame, then you know you've got a low spot there, and you should be able to feel any humps as well. But your eye sighting down that batten, there's really no substitute for that, so that's really going to tell you what's going on there. So I'm quite happy that that's a nice fair keel line now, with a handful of adjustments to some of the various different frames. So now we're in a position to be able to start the lamination of the keel. So we need a keel timber. Now, if you remember when I did the calculations for these laminations, I ended up messing things up and I didn't have quite enough height, so we had to add some extra on. We don't really want to be doing that again. So let's take a look at what we need. We've got keel laminations, 12mm thick by 120mm wide. We need 7 of them. So let's get the old calculator out. So 7 times 12. We've got a total keel thickness of 84mm. Now obviously I'm working at quarter scale, so let's divide that by 4. So I need a total keel thickness of 21. Now, similar sort of process to when we did the stem laminations and the stringer laminations. I've proposed lamination thicknesses here, but they can be changed based on what timber you're using, how it's going to make the bend. In all honesty, I've taken a pop at those thicknesses just based on a sort of semi-educated guess really. So you may well be able to change these. Certainly with the keel, and actually based on what I've been doing here, just kind of springing in battens and things, I think I'm going to be able to go thicker than that. So in theory, based on the fact that I've put 7 laminations, I would need to divide that 21 by 7. So I'd be using 3mm laminations. Now that's going to be really thin when it comes to doing this. And actually what you don't want to do is go too thin with these laminations because they're going to be really wavy throughout the boat. You want something that's going to help you to fare that curve and land nicely between them. So really you probably want the thickest timber that's going to comfortably bend cold. If I go to, let's say I divide it by 3 instead of 7, we can do that with 7mm laminations, and I think that's going to give me a nice nice spring throughout that keel. So let's get 3 at 7mm and we'll do the lamination at that. Okay, so we have our 3 keel laminations. Now they may look like they're way too high, but in reality what we need is to be able to come up to a point right in the center line of this keel. So actually we're going to need quite a bit of extra material because these lines on the frames obviously project on up to a point. That's going to be less so aft, but certainly up in the forward frames there's going to be a fair bit of that. So that thickness, now that I've got my laminations properly calculated, should be right. So we're going to get this glued in place. Now, same process that I've done with all the laminations. They're listed on the material cutting list as over width. So the keel on this is actually 100mm wide, and the stock list you will see specs 120. Now that is so that you can laminate this over width and then clean it up so that you've got perfect clean laminations. I've cut these to size from the get-go because I think I'm actually going to be able to align these really nice and neatly, and there's going to be next to no cleanup, which is going to make things nice and easy for this. The other factor with that is that if you are going to do the keel over width and then machine it down afterwards, there's another little step that you need to consider, because of course what we're doing is we're building this lamination inside these keel notches. Now, if you did that with 120mm stock, it's not going to fit in that keel notch, which means it's not going to sit down on the keel landing. So in reality, if you're doing that with the full-size boat, and you probably will want to do that because you're going to have a lot of epoxy and stuff, you're going to have slippage between laminations potentially. You might want to wrap the whole keel assembly in polythene. I think that's probably the way I'd do it if I was doing this on the full-size boat. So getting all of that, the extra width and the polythene and stuff inside those keel notches and getting everything perfectly aligned, that's going to be a bit of a juggling act. So if you want to laminate the keel on this over width and then clean it up afterwards, what you're basically going to need to do is to offset the keel upwards. And you'll just do that by basically putting a piece of timber that is the width of the notches into place here. So that could be a scrap piece of timber. It could even be little blocks just on each individual frame. And what you're going to need to do is to build up that height with scrap pieces. So to the sort of height that it is that we're looking at here. And then you can do your lamination on top of that. So what you'll be doing is effectively creating an offset that's going to lift all of those landings upwards and allow you to form the lamination up above the boat. The difference in curvature from the inside of this to the bottom there is going to be minuscule, not even noticeable, I don't think. So that's not going to affect things. So if that's the way that you want to do the keel, laminating it over width and then machining down, that's how you're going to want to do this step. Obviously the chines work fine because we can just hang them out over the side of the boat, but because we're doing this within the keel notch, that's an extra little thing that you might want to consider if you're doing that. I'm doing the exact width, so it's a little bit easier. Sorry I'm cheating, but I'm trying to push on and get this video done for you guys. Okay, so let's get this lamination glued up and clamped in place. So there we go, keel lamination done. We'll let that set up. I've got pretty good alignment between these parts, so cleanup's going to be minimal. It's really just going to be a case of taking the glue off there. Little trick I use there for just controlling slippage of laminations if we have any. Just put a clamp across the three and it'll just pull those into alignment. But other than that, we're pretty good. To be honest, the notches align a lot of it actually. So let's let that dry up, and tomorrow we'll take a look at it with all the clamps removed. So there's our keel lamination sat in place. Cleaned it up just a little bit with the block plane on this sides, just to get rid of the glue, so we haven't lost very much thickness at all with that. So one thing just left to do, and that is to do the wider sections of the keel that are included in this aft section of the boat. So if we take a look at that, you can see that the keel widens here with these reinforced sections. And this is to provide some extra strength in this area because we've got the drive shaft that runs through this, so we're going to be cutting a big hole out the central portion of the keel there. And then we've got to carry things like the rudder in this section of the boat. You can see that illustrated down here as well. Now I've drawn that in this illustration as additional laminations. What I think I'm actually going to do is just do this with full height timbers that go on the side. So we've got sort of two stages to this. So you can see it increases from just in front of this frame here, and then it increases a second time just before the final frame in the transom. So I think I'm just going to do this with two extra timbers on the side and strengthen it that way. That seems to be the way that makes sense to me. So I'll get some pieces of wood machined up for that and we'll get those in place. So there is our laminated keel stock. And you can see the makeup of this aft section here. So I didn't go full height with these most outer pieces because, as I said, this is going to get cut into follow the profile of the frame, so a lot of material is going to get removed here, so there's no real need to go full thickness with these outer sections. You can see we've got plenty of material there based on what we're actually going to be removing. So we could have gone a little bit lower with these actually, but not to worry, we'll get that all knocked down when we do the the fairing stage ahead of getting some planking on. So that's the keel tied up, and that is the last of our major components done that we're going to need to put in the boat before we can start actually sticking these bits together and starting to move forward onto the next stage of the build. My aim has kind of been to get all of these components put together and ready so that we can do a complete strip down. That's when you do the epoxy coating stage on the full-size boat. I may do something along those lines just to try and illustrate it to you on the scale model. As I said, I think the epoxy itself is going to be too big for the scale that I'm working on, so I may not use that, but we'll sort something out with that. We've got a little bit of work to do on the transom, so you might notice that the transom isn't actually on the boat at the moment. There's a few things going on with the transom, mostly in the way that it interacts with the keel and with the stringers and how various different parts slot together. And so I wanted those components to be put together first so that I can then work out the best process for doing that. So it's one I got to get my head around a little bit, but that's the last major job to do. So I think in the next video we'll look at doing that. We'll get the transom in place and then we'll be ready to do a complete glue up of the boat. So next video might be a bit of a big one. So hope you enjoyed this one, and I'll catch you in the next video. Cheers guys.